everyone. This is another Freedom to Feel conversation, and my guest today is Mike Noriega. So, Mike is the author of Uncollapsible Soul, a title that caught my attention immediately. Yes, I know it's based on a tragedy, but for some reason, my heart opened when I heard the word uncollapsible. Yes, it kind of resonated true to me. So the book's titled Uncollapsible Soul: How Do You Endure a Broken Heart Without Crushing Your Spirit? He's also a humanitarian, Christian leader, and inspirational speaker. Michael is an entrepreneur, financial professional, and Miami born native. So I'm reading this is a scripted little biography piece that I took for your longer biography that will be at the end of this video, your full bio. But for now, I would like to ask you a question, an open question. I usually begin with this question. Who is Mike as of now? How would you describe who you are?
I would describe myself as, first and foremost, a child of God. I think that's very cliche and how it comes across, but I think the truth of it is that when you recognize where your identity comes from, that everything else falls into alignment in your life. Because if you were to take an iPhone and bring it to the past 50 years ago, as
Yes.
valuable as an iPhone is, nobody would understand what its identity and use is for. But if Steve Jobs went back in time, the creator tells the creation what their purpose was. And so um, I am a person where Jesus is my message, people are my heart, passion is my pursuit, and I love my family very, very much. So that's who I am.
That's wonderful to hear. I love that. I have to say, I said off record, I love this faith based, which to me is truth based. I know some people they say I have faith in God, but a lot of times I ask them, um, how have you have you been through the path? Have you gone through the path of going beyond even faith and beliefs, and to the point of saying, "I know God"? It's a question for you now. Actually, I ask that question very often, so I would like for you to answer that question. Have you made that movement between faith, belief, and knowing God?
Yeah, because whenever somebody asks me if I'm a religious person, my immediate answer is no, I am not a religious person at all. Because my interpretation of religion is trying to get to God, trying to abide by a list of do's and don'ts. And it's really about being better than the person next to you. And it creates
Mm,
this comparison
yes.
culture. And I'm just not a religious person. But I would say that I am a person of faith because I don't think it's my job to get to God. I just believe that God came to us. And so for me, my life changed in entering into a relationship with God. It's very different to know about someone versus to actually know that person. Because the difference is it creates an intimacy, it creates empathy, it creates trust. And so when you realize that the God of the universe not only created you, but he loves you and that there is nothing that he didn't and wouldn't do to be in community with you, to be in relationship with you, it really changes your outlook of life because when the creator of the universe feels that much in love with you, instead of trying to live, I feel like a lot of the world tries to live for love or for strength or for victory. But when you have a relationship with God, all that goes out the window. Now you live from love and from victory and from strength. And so your entire being changes from that relationship.
Right. Yes, that I mean, it just resonates true. And the relationship part is interesting because I was talking to Somebody else, I think, yesterday about this relationship between what I am, and then God, or the infinite intelligence that's always here. And then the relationship, I know he mentioned that. He works with archetypes, the psychologist. And then it kind of resonated. Yeah, it's a relationship because the where I got today, in the sense of my spiritual knowledge and practices, came from that place. Like, oh, it's a relationship. By being a human alone, I had to have a relationship with something, because it felt very limited, being a body and a mind only. And with that in mind, a question that I have for you, it's how do you make sense of suffering and pain and injustice, in unnecessary, really unnecessary suffering and pain that we see in the world? How do you rationalize that?
It's very interesting that you asked that question because that's really what my entire book is based on. And for those that don't know, I wrote a book called Uncollapsible Soul that is really based on the events of a tragedy that happened in Surfside, Florida. Um, it's a suburb of Miami, and basically, a building, a condominium building, collapsed in the middle of the night. My grandmother and 97 other men, women, and children were just crushed to death in their sleep in the middle of the night. And it is the largest disaster in the history of Florida that's not hurricane related.
Right.
And that event, it really changed my life, which led to me writing this book. But there's another event that happened in my life before this that actually prepared me for the Surfside condo collapse. And I write about it in my book, but essentially, I was uh, in high school, I had had that first encounter with God and entered into a relationship with Him. And when I was 24 years old, I fell in love and got married. Uh, and 3.5 years later, I came home one night, and my wife at the time basically said, "Hey, I'm not happy right now. I need some space, so I'm going to leave and spend the night at my mom's house." Well, she left that night and never came back, and she was having an affair, and it just led to, if you can believe it or not, 60 calendar days later from that night that she left, we were actually divorced. And in all of that, uh, when I caught her having an affair and she finally confessed everything to me, I had saved myself for her when we got married. And so I definitely did not get married to get divorced. So in an act of desperation, I told her before we were divorced, after I'd caught her cheating, that, look, I love you, and I don't know what's happening here, but, like, let's work through this. And she basically said, "No, I want to be with this other guy," and moved on with her life. And
Right.
I thought the rest of my life was on autopilot. I had my business was doing well. I had the house, my beautiful wife, like everything. I knew what the rest of my life looked like. And in one night, my entire life turned upside down. And a big part of all of that is that, I truly trusted that God was going to take care of me if I did things in a certain order, if I was obedient to Him, that God would make everything work out for my good. And I believed with everything inside of me that God was going to save my marriage. I was praying, I was going to counseling, I was having so many people speak into my life. And the only way that I can explain it is that the night that my wife left me, my heart was broken. The day of our divorce, my spirit was crushed. And the difference is that a broken heart, none of us can avoid. That a broken heart is a season of grief, and you're you're going through mourning. And when we go through loss, we have to go through the cycle of grief. But a crushed spirit is something entirely different. that is where you lose your faith, your hope, and your purpose. It's like a well that's in a drought without water, or a bird without wings. What does a bird without wings do? What is a well without water? What's its purpose? And I took what was meant to be a life season and turned it into a life sentence, because a broken heart is inevitable, but a crushed spirit is avoidable. And so I lived a life for about a year, year and a half after that, saying, God, I tried it your way. Your way clearly doesn't work. And if this is how it works, I want no part of it.
Yes,
And
right.
so I spent a year, year and a half throwing myself into the world. And the best way I can describe it is that I was losing everything by chasing nothing. All I was looking for was external validation, because through the partying and the drinking and through just trying to fill this hole that was within my soul, what I
Right.
really craved was was love and intimacy that I was receiving from the marriage, but now was gone. And I was trying to essentially take a perversion of that and get other people to fill that space. And so what turned that all around and what led to me writing this book was that life season, because I had the wrong theology. I had the wrong understanding of suffering. And what I believed was, uh, I, I believed my relationship with God was almost transactional. God, if I'm obedient, then you bless me, right?
Yeah.
If I do this, you do that. And I thought God had let me down. What I had forgotten was two very important things. Number one is, when you work out in the gym, that muscle is not getting stronger, it's getting weaker. It's outside of the gym that your muscle gets stronger. When you put the right amount of carbs, protein, sleep, and water into your body, God designed your muscles to not only grow back, but to grow back stronger. So the next time you go to handle that weight, you can handle it and then some. If God made our bodies that way, how much more so did He make our spirits in that way? And the second thing was that I had claimed to love God. I had claimed to love Jesus, and then all this happened, and it really turned my faith upside down. I lost my faith, as I mentioned. And the reason I lost my faith was because it was attached to an outcome. It wasn't attached to Jesus. And so when I didn't get the outcome, I lost my faith. It was the wrong foundation. And what I realized was, wait a second, I claimed to trust God, and then when that was tested, I really truly didn't, only to realize that the God that I claimed to have worshiped, He stepped out of heaven with full authority of heaven, walked on earth with skin on, felt every temptation, betrayal, punishment, abandonment, pain, torture on a mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual level that we could ever feel. And He did it. He could have opted out of sorrow, but He chose not to. And so what I realized was that, wait a second, I can trust God, because there's nothing that I go to Him with that He has not felt Himself. In other words, He's not this Zeus like figure that's sitting on a cloud throwing lightning bolts from heaven. I think that's the picture we often have of God. But in reality, He was bruised for our transgressions, that He bled Himself out for us so that we could be with Him. And the beautiful part of that is that because of that, He is not the God of sympathy, He is the God of empathy. That it's not just when we go to Him that He feels sorry for us, but He actually feels what we feel. And
Mm.
so that is the thing, is that in order for suffering not to exist in the world, the reason suffering exists in the world is, the hearts of humanity are corrupt. And so that's why we need the presence of God in each of our lives. But part of love is free will. Because if you take away free will, What you have is a robot. You have someone that is programmed. And love, by definition, cannot be manufactured, manipulated, or even created. It has to come from free will. So you can choose to love God and love others, or you can choose not to. And that is why suffering will always exist in the world. But you have two ways that you can deal with it. You can either try to fight the darkness, or you can just bring a light into the night. And the light always overcomes the darkness in the night. And so that's what this book is meant to do. It's to bring hope through heartbreak and healing and restoration through suffering.
Yeah, how wonderful. Listening to you opens my heart. Yes, how beautiful. And I see that when I mean, I couldn't read the entire book because my heart was like breaking for that moment being just by imagining, because I have, I don't know, something in me just relives things, kind of, I'm very visual and imaginative. So, what I wonder from your perspective, Mike, is what do you think it happens when we lose the body? When the body, it's sometimes just tired. Some people lose the body because they're 100 and something, and then they just, the physical body, it won't be here. It's not meant to last anyway. So, what is your idea behind death and beyond? Like, what do you think it happens with those who pass on, per se, who left the soul, that left the body? Are they still here with us, like kind of delivering this message through you? How? Because that's my interpretation. For some reason, that's what I see by listening to you. It's almost like the lives, people who existed in bodies, they're still here, they never left, and you be inspired by them.
Yeah, I've heard it said this way, that you don't have a soul, you are a soul.
Yes.
What you have is a body. And I think that really speaks to the heart of the book, that the true you, which is your soul. See, a lot of people confuse spirit and soul. A spirit is your spirit inside of you, that human spirit, that makes up a part of your soul. So your heart, your mind, your body, and your spirit, which are also formed by relationships, like that social aspect of you that makes you desire relationship with others. All those things put together, that is your soul. And I think there's a part of us that is designed to live forever, that nobody ever wants to die, because I believe that was designed by God, that we are going to live forever, that our souls will live on forever. So, how do you navigate that while you're on earth?
Yes.
And
Right.
that's really, you know, that's because the problem, I think, with the typical religious environment and church culture is that, oh well, since you know by being in relationship with God, that we're gonna live forever in eternity. I think um, a lot of faiths and a lot of churches use that as a cop out, as an excuse to invalidate not living a fulfilling reality. And so the point is that, yeah, you can look forward to eternity, but you can also look forward to your reality, because you can heal through this and God can bring purpose to the pain. It's funny, not funny, that's definitely the wrong word, but it's very interesting what you said about how you're such an empathetic person, especially as you were reading my book, because for the first 10 months, I would say, after the Surfside collapse, all I knew was my own and my family's pain that we had to endure. And it was a very unique perspective, because all of the Surfside families that were involved or survived were at a reunification center. Due to my father being a local police chief, we were with the first responders on ground zero, looking from the street as the first responders were going through the rubble and searching for survivors and finding bodies and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And my grandmother was the 12th person found on the 6th day. And yeah, it was a very intense perspective because everything that everyone else was watching on the news, we were watching in real time in reality. And it wasn't until about 10 months later that I was added onto a WhatsApp chat where I was introduced to the other families that were involved. And once I was introduced to them and I started meeting them in person and spending time with them, it went from being a news story to being a relationship that created intimacy through proximity. And that rocked my world because as I started listening to their stories, learning their stories, I started to relive this from so many different perspectives. And me just being super honest, super vulnerable through this, I have to say I felt so unqualified to write this book every single day. I have never written a book before, so I felt unqualified to be an author. Let's start there. But the other part of this is that I felt very unqualified to write this book about other people's stories because I mean, my grandmother was the oldest one in the building. I mean, I was writing about people that lost, I write about Raquel Oliveira that she flew out the day before the collapse and her 5-year-old son and her husband were killed. And she lost her entire world overnight. And there's so many. I think about Angelica. I'm sorry, Angela and Devin Gonzalez, that they were all sleeping. Angela, her husband Edgar, and Devin were sleeping in the same bed because they had just watched the movie, and Devin didn't want to sleep by herself. And as the very foundations of the building were giving out and collapsing, that out of superpower maternal instincts from a dead sleep, Angela woke up, grabbed her daughter out of bed, and said, "Run!" And as they're both like in a daze running out of the room, the ground beneath them disintegrates and they fall 7 stories down. And Devin lands on top of her mom and rolls down another 20 feet. And Devin, who was 16 at the time, from a compound fracture, starts bleeding out externally. And Angela, from having her insides crushed, started bleeding internally. And they both survived. But her husband, Devin's dad, Edgar, died. And I started reliving this and writing about this and sharing their stories. And I had to fight myself and I had to argue with God about this. Like, God, like,
Yeah, can imagine.
are you sure somebody else can't tell these stories? Like, this is so dark that it's hard to write about the light. But the other side of that is that I was so blessed. I was so blessed through the intimacy of those relationships that there was too much light to write about. And the goal of this book was not to water down or hide the darkness, because let me be very, very clear. We live in a dark, rated R, rated NC-17 world. That's the world we live in. So my writing, it portrays that, but my goal through this book is to make the hope of the bright light of this book even like way outshine the darkness. And so one way that I share that in the book is I just shared about Raquel that lost her 5-year-old son and her husband just like that. And I'll never forget that the first day that I met her and Jonah Handler. Jonah, so there was 3 people that went down with the building that collapsed. So Jonah was the first person pulled out alive. And then Angela and Devin were the next 2. But Jonah's dad lived a couple blocks down. And again, another thing that's very dark about the book is Jonah was within his mom's apartment, and his mom was found alive right after him, but the first responders couldn't pull her out because her leg was caught, so they had to amputate her leg on the spot. You think about that for a moment and the pain that she had to endure. It's not like they're prepping you for surgery and numbing you and all these different things, but they had no choice if they were going to save her life. And unfortunately, she died. And so Neil, his dad, had to be the one to say, Mommy didn't make it. So the day that I met, and this was like almost a year later, the day that I met Raquel, Neil, and his son Jonah, it was at this pizza restaurant. And I was so engaged and present and captivated by the conversation that I was there for 3 hours and the restaurant closed before I even thought about ordering. And I noticed such a beautiful moment while I was there. And that moment was here you had Raquel that lost her son and her husband. And here you had Jonah that actually went down in the building and survived, but lost his mom in the process. And Jonah walked away to go to the bathroom. And while he was away, Raquel looked at Jonah's dad and said, You are so blessed to have your son. You have no idea how blessed you are to have him. And Neil, with tears in his eyes, is like, I know, I know. And Jonah walked back. And in a half joking manner, she looks at Jonah and says, if your dad ever gives you too much trouble, you let me know and I'll take care of you. But I understood what was happening in that moment, that Jonah and Neil symbolized everything that Raquel had lost, her husband and her son. And to Jonah, Raquel symbolized everything that he had lost, which was his mom. And here Raquel was being this nourishing maternal motherly figure to him, right? And vice versa. And it just reminded me of just how important community is, how much we need each other. That's why isolation is so toxic. Solitude and isolation are not the same thing. Isolation is where you are in a victim mindset and you have no timeline to get out of it, and you are inaccessible to anybody, mentally, physically, in any way. But solitude is going into hiding with a purpose for a timeline and for healing, meditation, prayer, all of those different things, time with God, whatever it might be. And so we need each other. And I saw how the pain that I'm gonna leave myself out of it for a second. I saw that the pain that the 3 of them had endured, that as they were in community, it didn't multiply their pain, it multiplied their love. It multiplied the healing, that a candle loses nothing by lighting another candle. And so these are lessons that I learned from each family of not just the pain they went through, but how they inspired me not only through my own healing journey, but how to find purpose in the pain. That Neil started what's called the Phoenix Life Project, which is a nonprofit organization that what they do is it's it's often recognized that when a national tragedy like that happens, that there are victims involved and they need help and counseling and mental health services and things like that. But the first responders have to go home with that also, and they're not thought of as victims. And so he started the Phoenix Life Project to help families and first responders of tragedies like this go through a program that was very effective for his son, so that others can find healing through the trauma. And I went to a gala this year for his charity, and he started off the gala by saying, because of these first responders here in this room, I get to celebrate Father's Day every year. And is to see how he took his pain, his trauma, and turned it into not just purpose but passion, which I would love to talk about more in a second. But that's why I wrote about each family. So the book is about yeah, we're going to live on into eternity. But how do you make your soul uncollapsible while you're here on earth?
Yes, how beautiful. Gosh, listening to you, it's just oh, it's a prayer. It's to me, it's a meditation in itself, a divine meditation. Um, that's the only thing I can think of in this moment. Um, when did you find out? When did you know that your soul was uncollapsible? I mean, I know you didn't use that word, but that word came, I would say, inspired by what happened. But did you have that realization before this happened, the tragedy of the Surfside building? And how did you remember that moment when you knew that your soul lived
I
forever?
Yeah, the moment that I realized that my soul was uncollapsible was when I passed the test. And I'll
Yeah,
explain to you what I mean by that.
yeah,
There's a reason that I shared my divorce story first, because which is kind of a plot twist. I reveal that later on in the book because the book is really not about me. The book is um, about the stories of Surfside and healing. But to leave out my divorce, I will say that still to this day, the hardest thing I've ever been through is not Surfside. It's the divorce I went through, because the loneliness, the depression, the rejection, the betrayal, the abandonment, the pain that I felt, I've never felt anything like that before. And when you go through something tragic like this, especially it's so public, people have a way of trying to be a solution to a problem that does not have a solution. It's kind of like 9/11 in the sense that everybody forgot about what divided us and just focused on what united us. And there's a beauty to that. But going through something like a divorce, you don't have that. It's kind of like, hey, we parted with you at the wedding, but there's no divorce party. No, those people are not there when you go through the divorce. And so the reason I share that story is it is so paramount to my story, because I learned through that process what I learned, how my character, my spirit, my soul essentially collapsed when it hit adversity because it was built on the wrong foundation.
mm,
Outcomes. Fast forward, what I called a curse in one season and what I only saw as a curse in one season, believe it or not, God came through of turning my tears of sorrow then into reaping a harvest of joy now, because I see now that that was actually preparation for Surfside, that He was preparing my heart, that He was healing my heart, and that He was teaching me what it really looks like to trust Him. And so when I showed up to the collapse site an hour after it happened, I mean, it probably took me a solid 30 or 45 minutes to convince myself that this wasn't a dream. You know how you have a dream that's so vivid that you wake up and you wonder for a little bit, was it just a dream? It felt so real, right? And I had to I had this battle with like, this can't be real. I have to be having a dream right now that I'm gonna wake up from. And then I started, it was the denial process of grief,
yeah.
right? Uh, so then I started to, you know what? This almost looks like a demolition. This must have been a planned demolition that my grandmother forgot to mention, and everybody was evacuated from the building, or like, I started thinking all these things, and it took a little while for it to set in that this was my reality. And with a sea of police lights and fire trucks and red and blue lights flashing against the side of the warped building that was still remaining because it was a partial collapse, I just had to get away from the chaos. And I felt like I was in hell. And so I just felt like I needed to call on heaven. There are situations in life in which no man can save you, no hero can save you, that it's you and God. And unfortunately, most people wait until those moments to come to God. But the test for me was I put myself in a corner into the building next door that was nearest to the side of where my grandmother's balcony used to face. And as I saw my grandmother's mangled, broken balcony that over the course of the past 20 years we had sat down on and had endless conversation and coffee and meals um, and you start to think to yourself, how did that become this? And thinking that my grandmother was somewhere underneath there and seeing my father weep publicly, which I had never seen anything like that before. I just started listening. I put in my AirPods and I started listening to this song written by Vu Worship called Shelter In. And
Yeah.
the song is basically the promises of Psalm 91 that God is our refuge and our strength, that 1,000 may fall to my left, 10,000 more to my right. But it's the Lord that's my refuge and strength, that He is my protector. Um, and I started to realize that the song was called Shelter In, and the very thing that my grandmother trusted her to shelter her in is probably the very thing that killed her. And it was such a visual revelation of just what it looks like to put your faith in into
Mm,
outcomes, really into anything in
mm,
this world, that it's a weak foundation, that it will collapse. And I
yes.
just remember praying to God to save my grandmother, to rescue my grandmother. And I had hoped that she was alive and that she could be alive and that she could be rescued. But I felt in my heart that it was like God's heart spoke to my heart. And it was as if he whispered, son, if your grandmother's alive underneath that rubble, she loved me so dearly. And if she is alive under that rubble, I can rescue her. And I will get the glory for her story of rescue, but it is my presence sustaining her if she's alive. But if her body is underneath that rubble, but her soul is in heaven, that's because she's safe, she's run into my arms, and her presence is safe in my presence. Do you trust me with either outcome? And that for me was the defining moment because 6 days later, when homicide detectives broke the news to us that they found my grandmother, it broke my heart, but it didn't crush my spirit. I think we have to accept the reality that none of us are making it out of this thing alive, right? So if we know that going into this, right, I'm not saying you should live your life in fear at all. I would even venture to say it is very healthy to have fear, but it's unhealthy for fear to have you. And there's a big
Yeah, I love
difference
that.
there.
I love that.
And so when you live your life from a healthy fear of knowing that, it's like, okay, my eternity matters. So how can I make my reality matter, not just for my eternity, but for legacy? Because um, what my grandmother's changed the mission of my life. She really has. That's why I wrote the book. I've never wanted to write a book in my entire that I've made many goals and dreams lists and vision boards. I have a vision board right behind me, right there. It never on there has there ever been write a book. But I discovered I had spent so much of my life trying to chase calling, never to realize that calling had been chasing me. It was just hidden behind fear. And so my mission has changed to really share my grandmother's legacy. I heard Mark Batterson in his book, Chase the Lion, one of my favorite books. He says it this way, that an inheritance is what you leave behind for someone, but a legacy is what you leave behind in someone. All that's left of my
Yes.
grandmother is all that she left in me. And my grandmother lived from an overflow of God's love. My grandmother loved like a child, where all they know is love. Like it's almost innocent to a degree. And that's how she was. And so I say all that to say that that's because her source came from an endless supply. How can your well of love run dry when the source of it comes from an endless supply? And so my mission has been to become that the overflow of my grandmother's love, which came from the endless well of God's love, to continue touching other people's lives today by helping them to find hope and healing through their own heartbreak.
Yeah. Ah, you made me cry. Well, I cry sometimes in the podcast, but not too often like this. So
I'm sorry.
true. Wow. Oh no, don't be sorry. That's I love. I mean, what's not to love about everything that you speak of? That's wow. Well, what's not to love? That's what it's a message for this moment. And I love the way you said that, right? Everything is collapsible. The body will collapse. The mind too. You see that the thoughts they come and go. Sometimes we feel happy, sometimes we don't. So many things can happen at the level of the body and mind, but there is something here that's always present and it
Yes.
never goes away. You're right, it's unlimited, it's infinite, it's the eternal. I love the way you said that too. How can we bring that flavor into this reality, this limited? How can we bring the infinite into the finite? And
Yes.
that's what you're doing. I know that you mentioned in a book, I think I read that. Just please clarify about going through suffering to learn and even losing the body in the way Jesus did, in a sense of to pass that message on. I do feel that the unnecessary suffering and most of the suffering in this reality, it's coming from ignorance, which is it's not in a pejorative way, but in a way that we're ignoring what's true, what's eternal, again, what's infinite, what's love, the unconditional love that's here. So it's the ignoring that truth that makes us suffer. That's my understanding, has helped me a lot too. Hopefully, it's not just a feel good understanding. I have been applying that and seeing that for myself, and it's just incredibly beautiful. So, do you see it that way sometimes too, Mike? I just wonder, suffering as the cause of suffering as being ignorance, ignoring God, ignoring the truth.
Yeah, I absolutely, because I believe the Bible to be truth, and I'll give you a couple examples as to why. The world says, "Follow your heart." Scripture says, "Guard your heart." Right? Well, there's a lot of wisdom in that because, like, our heart's desires are not always pure, and if you always follow that, you can have really good intentions and have really terrible results, right? And consequences. I mean, another thing is that um, the world really, another lie that the world says is that all things heal with time. That is a lie. That is not true at all. All things get buried with time, right?
Mm,
But if
yeah.
you do not face your past will face you. And here's why. It's because the you know, everybody wants to be passionate about something, and I believe that we are called to be passionate about something or about many things. But the thing that a lot of people don't realize is that passion in and of itself is neutral. That you can be passionately uh, excited about something that's positive, or like for example, like a cause, or you can be passionately hateful. And and so where what defines the difference? So a big part of my book is that the difference between allowing things to break your heart without breaking your spirit is the meaning that you give your pain. You get to decide that. We're each empowered to the meaning we give our pain. Why is that so important? Because passion is a result of suffering. How do you know if you're passionate about something or someone? You're willing to suffer for it. If you are not willing to suffer for it, then by definition, you're not passionate about it because it doesn't light your heart and your soul and your being on fire for it.
Mm,
Now,
yeah.
like I said, passion is
Yeah.
neutral. So the meaning you give your pain will actually decide where you go in the fork in the road. So what happens is if you believe that your pain happens to you rather than for you, because my life verse in all seasons is Romans 8:28, which says that God works all things for the good of those that love him and are called according to his purpose. I used to think that verse meant, oh, if I'm a Christian, all things that happen are good. No, he works all things for good, including working the good situations for your good and working the bad situations for your good. Right. So that's what I mean by when I say that, the difference is seeing that what happens to you is actually happening for you. But if you just believe that things happen to you, well, the first fork in the road is going to lead towards the path of resentment. Why? Because if you believe things happen to you, you'll have a victim mindset. And if you have a victim mindset, then you won't need to heal from it. Because the lie of a victim mindset is that if it's not your fault, it's not your responsibility. And that's just not true. If somebody hits you in a car, like you get into a car accident and it's that other person's fault, you can't just say it's that person's fault. So I have no responsibility to heal or how I respond to this car accident. Right. So if you don't deal with it in a healthy way, the first thing that you'll believe is that you're justified in resentment. And that means that you excuse yourself out of actually intentionally healing through the pain. And the result of that will manifest in bitterness. Your bitterness will start showing. And bitterness is just the opposite of what we think of when we think of passion. It's
Yes.
just passionate hate. That's what bitterness is. But if you go down that path of passion, but that passion is rooted in restoration, oh my gosh. As you go through the healing process, as you take responsibility in your restoration, the result of that is you're going to find purpose. Because if you look at any person that has ever done anything great in their life, the reason they're so passionate about whatever they became great at is because they went through some form of suffering where they used that to allow them to be restored and healed and renewed. And it's only when that happens can you find purpose in the pain. For example, with my divorce story, my gosh, that was and still is the worst thing I've ever been through emotionally. But I see now that that didn't happen to me, it happened for me. Because had that not happened, I wouldn't have written this book. We wouldn't be on this podcast right now. And and I would not my grandmother's life today would not be helping to bring hope and healing to other people and their heartbreak. In other words, my grandmother's death would have been in vain. It would have been wasted. But because God brought purpose to my pain, now in this situation, I've been able to bring purpose to that pain. It's kind of like one thing I write about in my book is it's kind of like this whole concept of how when if a snake bites a person, that venom is actually designed to poison your body, and really just kill you, right? Kind of like bitterness.
Yes.
That's what resentment and bitterness do over time. They just really crush your spirit, and they paralyze your soul. And so an interesting thing that I learned in this process is that the cure to somebody that's been bitten and poisoned by venom is actually anti-venom. Where does anti-venom come from? Well, it's actually extracted from the venom itself. In other words, the cure is hidden within the curse itself, right? And
Yeah.
if you're not careful, if you're not intentional about your healing, which in my book I outline
Ah, yeah.
5 very specific practical steps to healing. I call them the 5 requisites to restoration. If you're not intentional about that, then you're gonna miss out on extracting the anti-venom from the situation that you thought was meant to kill you. It was actually meant to restore you so that you can actually pass that anti-venom, pass that cure to other people.
Yes. Yeah, that's it. I love that the way you make this difference between purpose and passion. I never heard it that way. That's true because passion can be, we can be passionate about anything, something that could actually harm ourselves and others. So, so
Yeah.
true. That's very interesting to me. So, what made me curious was, I mean, besides the snake example, that's a good one too. But then, do you wonder why the venom doesn't kill the snake? She's holding that venom that could kill anything, but doesn't kill her. Do you ever wonder why?
Um, that is a very interesting question. I think because that snake doesn't die from its own venom doesn't mean it can't die from another snake's venom. And I also believe that if a different animal doesn't have venom, it still has a different weapon. And I think that really is the point of the book is this book was not written for those that were involved with Surfside at all. I mean, that was part of it, but even if somebody knew nothing about the Surfside collapse, they've never heard of it, is that the book is not about a situation or a circumstance. It's really about healing through all types of pain because
Yeah. Yes.
the same part of the brain that processes physical pain processes emotional pain. This is why when you go through a, a betrayal, a breakup, a burial, if you go through any type, you lose hunger. Your brain processes it the same exact way, and it's because our situations vary, but our pain is the same. And so we all have a responsibility to healing. So the weapon formed against you might have been different. It might have been a different form of venom. It might have been teeth. It might have been a shark attack. It might have been from a tiger. But we all have the same responsibility to healing.
Yeah, I love that. That's a beautiful message that I mean, it's resonate with my heart all the way. Has been my experience in life too. So another point, gosh, I would talk to you forever. We're almost at the end, and I have so many notes here. But then because the questions keep coming up from the things you say in the moment here. Um, so when suffer happens, this perspective is really helpful and really powerful and empowering. So whatever is happening that's painful, if we can see it that way, it's happening for us and not to us. But how can we see that in the moment? Like it has been my case. I could not see in the moment the whatever was happening for me. And then I made the situation worse, actually. And some people have taken their own lives because of it. So
Yeah.
how do we learn to what does it take? What's the difference between somebody that has that perspective and somebody who doesn't? And what it takes to carry with us and apply this perspective in real life.
I think that's the hardest part of all of this, right? It's the gap between your loss and your miracle.
Yeah.
It's that waiting season. It's that in between. It's what do you do? And really, that's what the whole book is about. It's about the in between. Um, this is a little bit of a spoiler, but not too much of a spoiler. Um, so I was extremely inspired by Devin's story because Devin, so she when she fell in the collapse and she had the compound fracture. Thank God those first responders they rescued her. and she survived. She almost bled out, but she didn't, and her life was volleyball before all of this. And when the rescue workers found her, the first thing she said is, "I have a volleyball game this weekend." Like, she was
Oh
like,
my
"What?"
God. Yeah, that's amazing.
And she's passionate about volleyball. But what was so cool about her story was that she had to go through not just physical restoration, but emotional restoration, because her life was never the same, and she lost her dad. And I think it was in October of last year of 2022, she had her senior night in high school, and her mom invited me to see her play her first official game back on the volleyball courts post collapse.
Yeah.
And it was such a powerful moment, and I write about it in my book. But the one thing that I want to share from that is that when she plays volleyball, she she's still in pain, but at the same time, she's healed. But it's a very different pain than when she was first wounded, because when she was first wounded, since she wasn't healed, she couldn't walk. She could have gotten infected. And so in my 5 steps, my 5 requisites to restoration, one of them is the fourth one is renaming your pain. And so this is kind of after you've healed. It's about a wound that has healed is no longer called a wound, it's called a scar. A scar doesn't look the same, right? Because the skin is calloused, it's thicker, but it can no longer get infected, it can't bleed out, and it tells a story of triumph. So the thing is that the lie of pain, because we're like, I'm never not going to have pain from this situation, and the same is true of all of us for specific seasons and situations in our lives. So really, it's how do you heal from that pain? And it's also, again, it's another thing. The easiest way I can say it is that the pain that you have is not to define you, it's to
Mm,
refine you,
yeah.
right? So it's just another way of you can have it, but don't let it have you. And when it has you is when everything changes. And so if you want, really quickly, I can go over what those steps are.
Yes, please. I have it in front of me. Yes, yes, please. Yes.
Awesome.
Yes, Mike.
So those 5 requisites to restoration are very practical, and I want you to think of a physical wound. I mean, this book is written for uh, emotional wounds, but uh, I believe that Jesus spoke in parables. He spoke in stories because our mind does not think in words. Our
Mm,
minds actually think in pictures, like a movie. And so imagine you're in the kitchen, you're cutting a tomato or something, and you slice right through your hand by accident, right? I think we've all done something like that.
yeah, for sure I have.
So the first step with that wound is you have to reveal it. In other words, you have to recognize your heartbreak. Or another way of saying that is you have to acknowledge the pain. That sounds so common sense, but believe it or not, most people don't take this first step. They actually deny the pain, they deny the wound, and they bury it because they feel shame or fear if they actually reveal it. Because let me be very clear about something. The number one reason that most people do not heal from their wounds is because healing hurts. It is painful to go back into your past and uncover things that you've never spoke about. But that same thing that you talk about, what broke you is the same thing is that's going to be the thing that awoke you to bring you to healing. So the first thing is you have to acknowledge it. But then the second thing is you have to relieve it. You have to respond to the grief, meaning you have to address your pain, right? So in that first moment of cutting your hand, the first thing might be, oh my gosh, I need to clean this out because there's debris in the cut, or that was a dirty knife or whatever, right? And so you put it under a sink and you clean it out, or you use peroxide. Or maybe the first step is to put pressure on it to stop the bleeding, right? But either way, you have to respond to it. Why? Because if you don't, either you'll bleed out or you'll just allow it to get infected. And that wound that just began in your hand, if it gets infected, will spread to your arm. And eventually, they'll have to amputate your hand or your arm, or eventually that infection will take over your entire body and kill you because you didn't respond to it.
Right.
And it's the same thing with our grief. So the third requisite is you have to release it. You have to relinquish your anguish. And that's another way of saying you have to surrender your pain. There comes a point when that open gash on your hand, you say, all right, I need to surrender to a medical professional. So I'm going to go to the ER and I'm going to trust a doctor. I'm going to trust a nurse to clean out this wound, which, by the way, is going to hurt. Healing hurts, right? They might have to give you some shots, numb you up, it's going to hurt, and stitch you up, it's going to hurt, right? Why does nobody want to go to the hospital? Because healing hurts. And so you have to surrender to the care of a medical professional. I think with emotional wounds, it is the same exact thing, that we are not designed to do this on our own. Why do we trust medical professionals for our physical wounds, but not our emotional and mental wounds, and even our spiritual wounds, right? So
Yes.
you have to surrender your pain.
Yeah.
And once you do that, right? Again, this is not like one, two, three steps that you do in the same day. You're not healed in the same day, but it's a process. And so the fourth requisite is you have to reframe it. You
Yeah.
have to rename your pain. What was once a wound is now a scar, or is in the process of becoming a scar. And even though it's not a scar yet, is not it doesn't mean that it's not in the process of becoming a scar. Our life is not a journey. I'm sorry, I said that so wrong. Our life is not a destination, it's a journey, right? We never actually arrive. So by definition, we're never actually going to be where we want to be or where we think we should be, right? And so we have to embrace the process and the promise that's attached to process. And then that brings me to step number 5, which is you have to renew it. You have to redeem your sorrow,
Yeah.
which is drawing purpose from your pain. When you redeem something, for example, if you go to the store and redeem a coupon, you are trading that coupon for money, for a discount, essentially, right? When you redeem your sorrow, you are trading the pain for purpose because now you have gone through the healing process. And so, if you can go through the healing process, why could you not be passionate about helping bring that same healing process to somebody else? I
Right.
really believe that God has strategically placed people in our lives that need to see us suffer well, that they need our story to inspire them, because it's not because of how great we are, it's because of how great God is. Like, by definition, the Bible says that God made us in his image. I don't interpret that to believe that, God made us with fingers and toes and hands and arms because that's how he looks. I interpret that
Mm.
as God is love. That is who God is. He is the full embodiment of love in and of itself. And so, for that very reason, he has put such a unique divine piece of his character in you that reveals and manifests itself in such a unique, special way that that person that needs hope through their heartbreak needs a touch of God through their life
Yeah.
by your life, because that piece of character that God has given you reflects him. In other words, we're not called to be people that have a spotlight on us. We're just called to shine as a bright light with his love shining through us. And I think when we have that mindset that our pain is bigger than ourselves, it starts to bring purpose to the pain.
Yeah, and that's true. Are you planning to are you a coach, actually a grief coach? Are you open to that to help people in general, or have a school, actually some sort of program that therapists and people in the business, coaches as well, can learn and pass this on to people who suffer and who needs this type of inspiration? Are you working on it?
I don't think I have the qualifications to coach people in this sort of thing in an official counseling role, but also I don't feel that I'm called to. I feel
Yeah,
that
yeah,
I feel that I'm called to speak publicly and openly, um, and I'm happy to do that one on one as those situations arrive.
yeah.
But yeah, I don't feel qualified, right? I'm not qualified to do that one on one, as a profession, but I am qualified to share my story. And so that's really all that I'm doing. I'm sharing um, what I'm sharing my story of really before and after. That's all this is, and I'm not just sharing it through my perspective. I'm sharing it what I've learned through the perspectives that I've learned through other people as well. And so I'm definitely, open to speaking at public events and gatherings and different stages across the globe. And so that's what I'm doing, and this is a perfect example of that. And I really appreciate you sharing your platform with me.
Wow, you do it really well. And I love what you said about calling, right? This is when we are listening to that voice, right? We know whatever is being called, that's what I do. And that's what I think what you meant about not taking it personally. So we don't in a way we're not a person anymore. We are just the embodiment of the voice of God, as you say, of that energy. And before we say goodbye, I wanna mention again your grandmother. Her name was Hilda Kima Noriega. Hopefully, I pronounced that correctly. I love the way I believe it was your father that talked about her in a book, and he describes her as somebody who loved unconditionally. That caught my attention. I opened my heart immediately. And another thing, that was one of the things. Of course, the title of your book opened my heart immediately, and then also after reading some of the stories in the book, your marriage. I read that too. And then the first thing I did was to look at your picture, and I saw you smiling, the headshot that you sent me, the big smile. And I'm like, oh my God, great, he's happy. So he went through all this, but look, he's happy, he's joyful. So that kind of brought me out of the my mind was almost, I was becoming almost very sad about the whole thing. And then when I look at your picture, I just
Wow.
became happy in the moment. So thank you so much for being this beautiful inspiration to our hearts. Thank you from my heart.
No,
And
thank you. Thank you for having me. My pastor, Rich Wilkerson Jr., earlier this year, he gave me the greatest advice I think I've ever heard. As a matter of fact, uh, I think the first words in my book are pretty much this, but he said that you should take your calling very seriously. Just don't take yourself too seriously.
yes, I love that. I wrote that
Yeah.
here because that caught my attention. Right, don't take
Yeah.
yourself. Yes, that's what came to me. Like, oh my God, I love his smile. And yeah, I mean, that was just incredible. It's very precious. So before we say goodbye, I usually ask a question to all my guests, and I have a technical question for you too. At the very end, I'll have the websites, but I would like to mention that too. What three experiences you wish everyone to have? That's a question that I usually ask in the same way. I know it sounds a little bit to me now, it's sounding a bit scripted, but there's something behind it. So I have to kind of follow the script. What three experiences you wish everyone to have before they die, before they lose the body?
Yeah, I think one experience everybody should have is none of us are able to avoid heartbreak or sorrow or loss. So I think one thing that everybody should experience is healing, is
Yeah.
experiencing the process of healing. So I think that's number one. I think the second thing uh, is is finding passion. There's nothing that feels better than doing something that makes you feel so alive
Yeah.
than when you're doing it, time just disappears. You
Yeah.
don't even feel time.
Yes.
That's why for me,
Yeah.
I feel like I'm called in this season to speak publicly on different platforms and stages around the world. Why? Because I'm so passionate about it. And honestly, I mean, we've been on this for over an hour. It feels like 10 minutes for me, honestly,
Right. Yeah.
because I'm so passionate about this. And so that's the second thing. And I would say, lastly, the third thing is everybody should experience having a story of how they drew purpose from the pain. But
Mm.
you can't do that unless you go through healing and unless you become passionate about that healing. And then you can draw purpose from the pain. And then that trio, that's a triple threat right there for somebody to change not just their life, but someone else's life.
Yes. Ah, beautifully said. And then another question, because that was should have been my last question, but another one came to mind. How do you define success these days, Mike? What is to be successful to you?
I think success is I think success is living in your calling. And my calling is to leave a legacy. And I don't define that, I don't measure that by what I'm leaving behind for anyone, but rather I define that by what I'm leaving behind in someone. But legacy doesn't begin when you die, legacy begins while you're alive. It just lives on after you're no longer alive. And so I think success is someone, stepping into your calling will take facing fear without a doubt. And when someone steps into their calling
Yeah.
and becomes passionate about it and all those different things that come with it, oh my gosh. I think when you light yourself on fire, people will come and watch you burn. But
Yeah.
and that's I've heard that saying before, but I think what happens is those that get closest to the fire will themselves get caught on fire. And it's kind of like I said before that a candle loses nothing by lighting another candle. And so I think that's how we be a light into the night. It's how I define success is not just you building your legacy, but I think when
Mm,
you truly step into your calling, that it's not about you,
mm.
but it's about helping other people leave a legacy.
Yes. I asked the question for a reason. Yes, because that's what I felt that you would say, and you did. How wonderful. Thank you so much again for being you. Thank you. Before we say goodbye, where's the best place to find more information about you besides the website? I do have the website. I would like you to mention that too, but also social media. Are you on Facebook and all the other platforms as well, Mike?
So my number one platform is Instagram, and so I'm at the real Noriega, which is my last name, and the dot real dot Noriega. I also have uncollapsible soul on Instagram, and then I'm also on TikTok and YouTube under the same handle, and then under Twitter and well, under Twitter, I'm under Uncollapsible, and on Facebook, I'm under Uncollapsible Soul. And everyone can also go to MikeNoriega.com or uncollapsiblesoul.com. And the book is right now at every major retailer, which is whether it's Amazon or Barnes and Noble. And yeah, if anybody would like to reach out, uh, I, I would love to connect with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again for your presence, and we'll talk soon. Bye for now, Mike.